So I would like to introduce now the wonderful Morgan Bengel, who is a site manager at the Old Newgate Prison in Towermine. And after graduating from the University of Michigan, ding ding, my alma mater, with a degree in history, she was drawn to New England for its rich and deep past. Her passion for history and museums led her to pursue a master's in public history from Central Connecticut State University. And while there, she was able to intern with the State Historic Preservation Office, which ultimately enabled her to take on her current position at Old Newgate. So welcome, Morgan.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Yeah, Tara, right here?
We're all good.
Great. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah? All right. Just let me know. As Sarah said, I'm the site manager at Old Newgate. We are open. So I'm going to go through some of our past, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we're operating today at the end of it. And I'll also leave plenty of time for questions. All right, Old Newgate. This is the saga of Old Newgate, because when I was putting this together, it just really showed the ups and downs of the whole prison years. So that's what you're going to get to experience with me. Before we get started, just to orient you, first, has anyone been there? Figured. I always like to know. I just assume. Most people have more experience there than I do, but I do really love it. So it is, like you all know, copper mine, prison, tourist attraction. It is recognized as the National Historic Landmark, which is one of the biggest, which is, I think, the most prominent designation you can have as a historic site. It's also recognized as a state archaeological preserve, which means nothing can be taken off of the site. So when school groups come, we tell them they have to even leave the rocks there because they could be important. And this is a nice aerial view. And we've had more work done since then, so come and check us out. This presentation is not about the copper mine, but I feel it's really vital to discuss that because it's the reason why all of it is there. So the copper mine, the colonists of Simsbury at the time, so this is a Simsbury story, they came in 1705, 1707, saw the green rock, so they just started digging, wanted to make a buck as any good colonist does. And it wasn't very profitable. So between regulations by the monarchy and the fact that the ore was not very good quality, it quickly faltered. So after many attempts, it stopped in about 1750s. And that leads us to the next part of our story when the Connecticut government, the General Assembly at the time, decided to purchase it as a prison. When they did that, everything you see here was primarily not there. So the visitor center wasn't there, obviously, right? The ruins weren't there. The wall was not there. Our very iconic wall was not there. The guardhouse was not there. The only things that did exist were the warden's house, which was probably much smaller. He was just living there at the time, and they decided to make him warden. And 2 ore shafts. That was it. Blank slate, nothing existed, but they decided to make it a prison anyways. So why? Why would you think that an abandoned copper mine would serve as a suitable prison? Our first quote, and I'm just going to read from here so I'm not unfacing you, says, "We have been appointed to explore the copper mines and determined whether they may be beneficially applied to the purpose of confining, securing, and profitably employing such criminals and delinquents as may be committed to them by future laws or in lieu of infamous punishments." So this is from an overseer's report, and you'll see me quote them often because they're just too good not to quote. And these were the people on site at Newgate reporting back to their bosses, right, the government. And to break this down a little bit more, what they're saying is we thought the copper mine would securely confine, right, it's an abandoned copper mine, profitably employ, and imprison in lieu of infamous punishments. So this was a reform attempt. They were trying to keep them in, employ them, because to not work was very sinful at the time. Working is good. And imprison them in lieu of infamous punishments. So cropping the ear, whipping, capital and corporal punishments that were happening. This was an attempt to reform prisoners. So it might seem really barbaric to us to imprison people in a copper mine, but it was an attempt at reform. And then came Jon. So I don't know if anyone knows, this is this is Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, popular culture recognition. But he could have been the first prisoner because we have here that the first prisoner was John Henson, and he was 5 feet 6 inches. He had black eyes, dark hair, and a fair complexion. So basically Jon Snow. John Henson was imprisoned December 22nd, 1773, and he escaped January 9th, 1774. For those math whizzes, that is 18 days after he was imprisoned. which isn't a great start for the securely confined, profitably employed prison that was built. How could he have escaped, right? So my next overseer report, again, this is 1773, and this says, "We have also fixed a large iron door about 6 feet from the surface of the ground, which we apprehend will be effectual security." They had a door in one of the shafts, right? They had a door. So what happened? A year later, 1774, we see them write, this is my favorite quote of all time. "Your honors must have heard that the prisoners have all escaped." Right? End of story. I could leave right now. They're reporting to their bosses, right? "Your honors must have heard that the prisoners have all escaped. It would be long and perhaps difficult in writing to give a particular and distinct account of how this was done. Your honor will excuse us if we only say that they effected their escape by the help of evil-minded persons abroad before the necessary and proper securities could be completed." So it wasn't their fault, right? It was evil-minded people. They were coming in. John Henson, rumor has it, escaped when a woman, no one knows, came in the night and let down a rope down the shaft that didn't have a door, right? So they didn't have guards. Captain John Viets, you see him right here, first warden, lived in Viets Tavern across the prison. He was there, but he wasn't guarding it all the time because he thought that it would be secure. So it wasn't a good start. So they fixed their mistakes. They said, "We immediately set about making further securities that your honor directed and have built a strong log house," log, mind you, "about 36 in length and 20 feet in width with timber." All right, so they built a house. They built this directly over the ore shaft because it was over the ore shaft, right? So for a while it took me, it was weird to understand because they had to go into the guardhouse and go down a trap door, and that's how they got in, and it was a little confusing and cumbersome. But that was their intent, was because they kept escaping and they made securities, they put it over the ore shaft, placing the guards on top of them. They also said, "We have secured the east shaft," the one that John Henson escaped from, "where the first prisoner escaped, with iron and stone in every other place where we thought it possible to escape." So on further thought, they went back, took a look at the place and said, actually, there are some places that they might have escaped from. So they took some precautions. But that didn't stop the escapes, all right? So April 1774, we have 5 escapes show up. 6 escapes in November, June, another 5, August, 4. George Washington sent prisoners, 1775, just a side note. 3 escapes in 76, 2 escapes in 77, and during this escape, so 25 in total for those first 3-4 years. 1777, they burned the guardhouse down. So that strong log timber house, they just burned it on an escape attempt. So that was also kind of a fail. But the guards didn't give up, right? They are strong guards. And they reopened in 1780. And this time they built a barrier. So this image here is one of my absolute favorites. This was done by a prisoner, Richard Brunton, who was imprisoned at Newgate for counterfeit. He was also an artist, and he painted portraits of the warden and his wife while he was there, and he also made this engraving. And it's probably the only depiction of what prison was like at the time. It's a really kind of skewed, he calls it a perspective of Newgate, but it tells us what's going on. So we see a dog is in there, the whipping post, guards, the buildings, he labeled all the buildings. He has hunters on the outside. It's beautiful. It has so much detail. We use it for our school groups. The other key factor here is this barrier. So at this time, they built a picket fence. And it's hard to see in this picture, but there are little spikes. So maybe it was a spiked picket fence. Before then, mind you, a barrier didn't exist. So all those escapes, if they got out of the mine, they just ran for the hills. But the prisoners didn't give up either. So a picket fence was built February 1781. In May of 1781, so just a couple months after, the largest mass escape occurred. This was during the American Revolution. See, it's just up and down, up and down. This was during the American Revolution, and Newgate, as many of you know, was a prison for Loyalists. And the Loyalists band together during this particular day in May, and they managed to get out. Story goes that a woman was sent down to visit her husband, and as they opened the gate, the prisoners bombarded, killed one of the guards, wounded a couple others, and managed to get out. So this account reads, last Thursday evening, the prisoners confined at Newgate in a number of about 28 made their escape. They killed one of the sentries, a Mr. Sheldon of Suffield, wounded one or two others, and carried off the arms belonging to the guard. Several of the prisoners have since been taken, so many of them were brought back, but doesn't mean that they weren't able to get out, even with that picket fence. So this is a long one, but I do want to read it because I've been showing you a lot of these overseer reports and newspaper articles, so you're getting a lot of the voice of the guards, which is crucial for this because it's very much their battle to keep the prisoners in. But this was that same escape, the 28 Loyalists, and this was their perspective. So 2 of them got out, and they wrote about it afterwards, and it's really interesting. So I just read you this, what happened. Mr. Sheldon was killed, they got out, they were taken back. Pretty short. This is how they described the event. 18 of them, prisoners, being sent to the kitchen to cook, they found means to break the lock of the door, which kept them from the food of the ladder, from the foot of the ladder leading up to the guardroom. They now doubly resolved to make a push should the door be opened, which fortunately was the case at about 10 o'clock at night to let down a prisoner's wife, who had come there and was permitted to see him. Immediately they seized the fortunate moment and rushed up, but before anyone else had got out, the door was closed down on the rest, and he, the brave Captain Hathaway, scuffled with the whole of them for a few minutes and was wounded in 3 different places, when he was nobly seconded by his friend Thomas Smith, and afterwards by the others. They then advanced upon the guard, consisting of 24 in number, and took the whole prisoners, which were no sooner accomplished than they brought their companions out of the bottomless pit and put the guard down in their room. Took the prisoners out, put the guards down. Then marched off with their arms and ammunition, but were soon afterwards obliged to disperse. This we the subscribers declare, by the way of the king's loyal subjects, vulgarly called Tories, are treated in Connecticut. So this was propaganda. They don't talk about killing a guard, right? Brave Captain Hathaway fought valiantly. So it's a really interesting depiction, and we do this with school groups too, having them both skit out the different events and see how different they are. So that was from the perspective of the prisoners. Okay, so I told you about the barrier, right? They got out even though the barrier was there. So they built the wall. This is iconic, right? Everyone who knows Newgate, or even if you haven't even been in there and drive down that road from Massachusetts, know of the wall. This was built in 1802. So the prison opened 1773, 1802. Again, quick math whizzes. It's about 30 years without a wall. The iconic Newgate prison wall was only there for the last half of its time as an operating prison. Even with the wall, they still attempted to escape, but at this point we do start to see the decline. So they have elaborate but very unsuccessful escapes. And this one's pretty interesting. I didn't want to read it all out to you, but the plot points are dramatic. So this is Newgate, May 27th, 1823, just a few years before it closes. The wall is there, and this is an insurrection at Newgate. Started with an officer received a blow from a fire shovel. He's knocked out. Prisoners sound their signal, and 3 other insurgents join in. Prisoners proclaim, "The day is ours." Can't you just see that in a movie? The day is ours. And urged others to join them. The first officer regained consciousness, fired his pistol at and hit a prisoner. The guards raised the alarm. Axes are thrown and one hits a guard. Sergeant and guard enter the shop and discharge his pistol at them. Corporal and 3 sentinels arrived and prisoners surrendered. Right, so this one ends with them surrendering. It's a little bit different from our John Henson story where he just escapes in the night and no one knows what happened. Right, this time it's laid out. This is now functioning more like a prison that we've seen. There's guards on duty all the time. Prisoners are still staging escapes, but the chance of them succeeding is much less. So in the 50 years or so at this point that Newgate's functioned, it's seen this big drastic shift, being the first state prison. And like I said, that's only a few years before it closed. And so the close of it is also really telling. So William Stewart, he was a really infamous prison counterfeiter. He's the one that spearheaded this insurrection. And when he got out, he wrote an autobiography, a very braggadocious biography. And he refers to Newgate as a school of rogues. And what he's referring to there is this. So this cell block was built in 1824, just a year after that insurrection. And it's built to try to move prisoners out of the mine and try to separate them a little bit. Beforehand, they were all in the mine. There were no guards down there. That would have been dangerous. They were in the mine. They were learning each other's skills. they were plotting insurrections, right? And they weren't being very well-behaved men. So they built this cell block, but even then, they didn't have solitary cells like we think of in prisons. So they were still housed together, and it was still an issue, which is ultimately why they closed. Even after building this, 1824, they closed in 1827. So still weren't competing with modern penitentiaries that were popping up. Right after Newgate closed, places like Eastern States Penitentiary in Philadelphia, they opened, and they're some of the first to really try their hand at real solitary confinement. They pushed it a little too far, but that's another story. And so that's what William Stewart, a prisoner, recognizes, that they were a school of rogues. They were learning from each other, planning insurrections, etc. But there was one last escape, and this was Abel Starkey, and we talk about this all the time. So this is an image of the well looking up. And on the last night before Newgate moved to Wethersfield, so when they closed in 1827, they marched the prisoners to Wethersfield. And Abel Starkey requested to stay in the mine. You could either stay in the cell block, stay in the mine. And he was known to have $100 on him, legend has it. And he attempted to climb the well shaft, but fell to his death. And there were only $50 found on him. So it's believed that he bribed a guard the $50. And whether the guard cut the rope on him or he just fell, he was the last unsuccessful escape story. So it starts with a really, successful and prominent escape story and ends with Abel Starkey, which is, again, very dramatic. So what was it all for? I make light of these stories, right? They're funny. It's dramatic. It's exciting. They're romanticized. Abel Starkey's romanticized. But the escape stories do really drive this whole story. So I told you about all the shifts and everything Newgate had gone through. William Stewart, that prisoner, he wrote his worst crime was insurrection at Newgate, which was a result of a legalized oppression. So he didn't do anything that bad until they put him in Newgate, and he was forced to misbehave. The Loyalist prisoners referred to Newgate as hell, woeful mansion, and horrid dungeon were some of the words they used. And the travel writer wrote that Newgate was designed as an object of terror. So these are just a few glimpses at the atrocities of Newgate. And again, I know that you all, especially if you've been there and in the mine, 52 degrees, dark, wet, cold, it's pretty awful. But to know that they also, at that time, recognized it as an awful place only leads you to think a little bit more about why they would have tried so hard and risked their lives to get out. It's really telling. So, I haven't spent too much time talking about the prisoner's life, but they were just confined down in the mine until they would come above and work in the prison yard. But otherwise, they slept in the mine, they lived in the mine. So, that is my story. Nice and quick and easy, but ups and downs. We are open right now, so I mentioned in the beginning that we are currently open and operating. Right now we're open Thursdays through Mondays, 10 to 4:30. We're excited to be open. Restoration happened at let me show you. So the big guardhouse in the middle of the prison yard. I'll get to it. So this big guardhouse was falling down the hill, and that's been restored. So that is now safe and secure, and we've been open since last season. We've seen a lot of visitors, seen a lot of school groups. We're having Halloween this October. I put some flyers over there, October 12th and 19th. It'll be really awesome. And we couldn't be open without wonderful people to support us. So thanks for coming here and listening to me. Any questions? I'll get to the back. About, operation currently or the history.
First time I was ever down there was 60 years ago.
Wow.
And you went everywhere in a dress and heels.
I've heard it. Sounds familiar.
Climbed down the rope. It was
civilized. It was a ladder.
I don't know. There was a ladder, and you got down there, and you knew how cold it was going to be, and you looked around a little bit, but there was no lighting.
Yeah.
At the time, so you went back up.
What did you do?
I remember talking to a woman whose job it was to clean the kerosene lantern, chimneys. They have the glass chimneys that they took those down at one point at least to light it up.
Yeah, so one of my most favorite aspects of Newgate, besides this fascinating history, is its more recent history, which is its time as a tourist attraction. So even as a prison, tourists were flocking to it. They have records of thousands that would come and pay guards money to be let in and then pay extra to go into the mine, which is just outrageous, but it was a thing at the time to visit asylums and prisons and learn what the systems were like. And then when it closed and it was run as a private tourist attraction, which is when many people visited it, they had a bear and monkeys, World War I tank, thousands of historic artifacts that weren't relevant to its time, until the state took over in 1968 and they purged it of everything that wasn't related to its prison years and started running it as more or less a prison museum. But it's really fascinating how people have been so attracted to it for so long, and so we hear so many stories about its time as a tourist attraction and continuing. So it's
When were you able to go? I was in it another time, and you went in at a lower level, and there was some lighting in there at that time. Do you know when that happened?
And you went down the ladder to do that? No.
You went in, I don't know where.
Stairs.
It was an opening, and you were in the mine.
So after 1972, the state put in stairs, and they probably added in lights at that time too, and let it open more of it. Probably. And I will tell you, it's hard to keep lights down there. It's so wet, everything. It's really hard. We're always, and it's still not great, but anything is better what they had, right? So miners were there trying to mine out ore with no light, with candlelight, right? And you're looking for the color, trying to haul out rock. It's just outrageous.
Do you have any sense for the sentences that folks were in there for? So how long were they there, and what were the health outcomes that went along?
And what were the health outcomes? Yeah, okay. Sentences would range, again, this is trial and error. That would have been my other title for this besides Saga. So crimes at least started counterfeiting, burglary, horse thievery, those types of things. Sentences would be anything from, most of them were a matter of months. Some of them got into years. Towards the end, they might have started sentencing life sentences, but that wasn't the intent. They didn't want to pay for someone for the rest of their life, right? That would have been kind of outrageous. The idea was to reform them, get them back into society. And it really varies. So we lay out a really good example of someone who committed rape and was there for, a couple of years, and someone who attempted murder or a smaller crime. The sentencing is really off, and it's really weird to look at. But I think that would be the case today, even if you were to take a sampling of everybody. Depends on judge, location, personnel. And then you had another question.
Health outcomes.
Outcomes, health. Great. Health outcomes are really interesting. That has been widely debated. So a lot of people, let's see, my two predecessors before me, the site manager, Chris Riley, does anyone know him? Mm-hmm. Yeah. His, from what I read, I did not get to meet him, but I read all about him. And his stance that he took was more or less, do you know this stance?
No, but I love Chris Riley.
Yeah, okay. So the stance that I read, and people have told me, that he saw it as not a health resort, but more or less a healthy place. So we don't have a lot of records of people getting sick. There was one slight epidemic and they closed, but for the most part, the argument is that they were removed from society. They were in a pretty, consistently temperatured place, 52 degrees all the time. So it's not too hot, it's not technically too cold. And they were removed from society, which was a big one. So the argument was that not a lot of them died from natural causes like that, or I don't know how sick they were. I do read records of their legs getting, I don't know, I want to say gout, but getting really swollen and gross, whether it was the shackles or the mine conditions. And then most of them seem to have injuries and death from trying to escape. So that's, I would not argue that it's a healthy place, but I think there is something to say for the consistent temperatures. It's not too hot really.
What's happening with Beats?
Beats. Okay, there we go. The number one question. Beats Tavern. Well, the East Granby Historical Society asked to hold a program there next spring. America's First Cookbook or something, and we agreed to open it up as long as nothing stops that in the off season. So that'll just be a one event first floor open type of thing. Right now, we had the outside repainted and re-roofed. It's gorgeous, smells awesome, cedar roof. So that was a huge step. We also had it stabilized last year. The foundation was buckling in. So those were huge. The inside needs a lot of work. And it needs work, restoration work, right? Preservation work, which is even more expensive and more timely. My boss is throwing around really big numbers. I don't know how. They're pretty big in terms of getting it done. We really do want to get it done. Right now, the path that we're following is restore it and get someone in there to run a catering out of it. National Park Service has buildings on their property, and they don't necessarily run the food aspect of it. So we do want to see it used for something along those lines. But it's still, you know, a good 5 or so years until the building is able to be occupied. It has a gorgeous ballroom on the second floor, yeah. That can hold like maybe 4 people right now, type of thing, just for safety. So it's on our minds. We're working on it. Yeah, getting the outside good was a big step, and now it's safe and it's not going anywhere, and we can work on the inside.
It seems to me, way back, I read something about they did employ the prisoners somehow. Did they?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah, so we didn't talk too much about prison life. So their intent when they said securely confined, profitably employed, was to have them mine. They thought that it would be successful. They quickly realized that putting mining tools in the hands of prisoners wasn't a good idea, number one, right? Number two, they also realized that the quality of ore wasn't good, which is why the people who had been there to actually mine had stopped, right? So it just wasn't working out. So that did not last long at all, if a year even. And then they eventually built workshops and built barriers above ground, so they would bring them above ground, 4 o'clock in the morning, have them work making nails, shoes, barrels, and then send them back down at 4 p.m. So they did make, and there's a lot of newspaper articles, Newgate nails, they were widely dispersed. They were trying to make it, again, trial and error, first state prison, they were trying to make it profitable and make it sustain itself. I don't think that really worked.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
What was involved in the restoration of the main building?
Yeah,
that you had to do
that's
when
a
you
great-
took over the property after it being empty for so long? And then the other question is what Washington had sent those prisoners there for.
Yeah, great. Okay, so restoration, what restoration took place or how reopening has been? Both? Yeah, so restoration was that guardhouse because the whole site is really hilly. You've been there again? I mean, the whole area is hilly, but it's really hilly on the inside because it's all built on mine tailings, so it's just loose rubble underneath. They hauled the rock out and that had to go somewhere, so it just went where they are. So the foundations aren't very stable, and that guardhouse was falling down the hill. In order to restore it, I was not here, but I've seen crazy pictures. They cleared it out from underneath, kind of lifted it up, secured it with rods. It was a huge project. That being said, oh, do you want that? Okay. That being said, it did not take 9 years. What took 9 years was the state process to do that, and then my position, the site manager, had retired. The museum director for the 4 state museums had retired. So more or less it was a lack of stewarding that got it. Local representative Tammy Załastowski was a big part of that. To reopen it, they had an open house. So in terms of the stewardship, that took a couple years. Opening it after 9 years, the urinals were very gross, and I did that. Yeah, I did all of that. So, yeah, it was. It's been hard. There was no electricity in the building for a couple months just because a conduit had gone bad on the outside, and I was fighting with Eversource about that. Electricity's been hard, so the buildings need to be lived in, right? Houses need to be lived in. So it's looking really good, not only because we put money into it, but because I'm there every day, my staff is there. And so in terms of the property, it's looking really good. It's feeling really good. It's just we're there all the time now. Does that kind of answer a restoration question?
Yeah, and then
Yeah, second, George Washington. Yeah. Washington. He sent court-martialed soldiers there, calling them atrocious villains and saying that they could be nowhere near the camp. So my understanding is that they would have carried soldiers on the outskirts of their camp, probably, if they had tried to desert or something along those lines. But these ones, for whatever reason, were awful, and he wanted them as far away as possible. So he sent them to the Simsbury prison referring to it as such, Simsbury Prison. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something. So I saw a presentation by the people that your predecessors, when they were, because I live right next door to the prison, and when they were trying to secure it and keep it from sliding down the hill. It's sort of interesting because and you may know this, but for the audience, they couldn't just use a regular pile driver because everything was so fragile. So they had to put out a nationwide bid for a company that could just put down the very, very tiny cable with just a slight vibration to go down into the rock. And so they did that, and I was worried because I was next door. I thought it was going to be this like,
Oh my God.
but it wasn't. You couldn't hear a thing because they just had to vibrate to get this cable down into the rock to secure it. And so that took months, so they had to go so slowly. But the other thing that was funny is that as they were sifting through the rubble, it was also contained artifacts that were referred to in some of these letters that the prisoners wrote, because the Connecticut Historical Society has these letters on file. And so like one of the letters said, it was a loyalist, and he was upset because they'd eat the food by putting their hands in, and taking it out of the bowls, and he was very upset about that. So in the Old English, Fashioned, the way they spell things, he said he fashioned himself a fork. And they found in the rubble, they don't know if it was the one he did, but a fork that he had, carved and chipped out of a piece of metal, a two-pronged fork. And another thing that they had in the letters was how they were gambling. And nobody could figure out how they could gamble. And when they sifted through the rubble, they found a perfectly made dice that someone had carved and put, got the little one on one side and the two, and that. So they had this dice to gamble with. So there's some cute stories like that about the process of renovating.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Any other questions, comments?
Well, I will mention Chris Riley because he was fantastic.
No, oh my gosh, did I ever tell you, reading through the first thing I did when I was interning with the state was archiving Newgate's records, and I found, newspapers about him and his tours, and I was like, who is this man? I need to talk to him. And then I found his obituary, and I almost cried in the records. I watched his life through my eyes, and he seemed, Mr. Newgate, he just seemed amazing.
I always wanted him as my tour guide, but he does tell one story. He did extensive research on the Loyalist breakout.
Yeah.
Where he would tell in the story that the warden, there was one of the guards who was shaking in his boots during this breakout, and the warden yelled to him, "Chicken, catch a Tory." Something you remember from the tour after 30 years.
Yeah.
It's great. That and him humming in the solitary room. He had perfect pitch, and he would make that room rock.
Oh, that's funny.
Have you ever hummed in the solitary?
We had the Jolly Beggars concert, a Celtic music band, and I took them through, and they were in there, which was pretty cool, 3 Celtic music singers. We've had some other groups. That room, it kind of drives me crazy. I really don't even like to talk in there, but maybe I should embrace it and try to hum. Because it drives me, and then I bring kids in there, and I go a little nuts.
You have the encampment this weekend, right?
Yes, great.
Is it 14th?
5th.
5th, Connecticut.
Great, thanks for marketing that for
And
me.
talk about the bats.
Okay, I love talking about the bats. All right, we have bats. It's awesome. Bats are incredible. So our bats hibernate. Staff likes to say that we have a lease agreement with them. So they come in for 6 months, we leave, we come back in for 6 months. So they are there. They're starting to scout it out right now, but they are there, November to April. As long as it's cold. They like to hibernate in the mine because it's always 52 degrees, so in the winter it is pretty nice in there. And they're hibernating because there's no bugs to eat. So last year they counted 10, which is sad, but on the uphill. They only counted that many because they are endangered, as many of you probably know, because of white nose syndrome, which is a disease, fungus, that gets on them and irritates them so much during the winter that they cannot hibernate through the whole winter. They just keep waking up and use all their energy. It's really devastating. It's devastating bat populations everywhere. So we have little brown, big brown. Little brown are state listed as an endangered species. Big brown are doing okay. And we had one tricolored, which are state listed as endangered and about to be federally listed. So they were pretty excited to have us tricolored. They haven't seen that in a few years. So we'll see what the count is, but we have seen them start to come back. Crazy. Bats mate right now. And I was like, how does that work? It's fall, right? And they're mammals, which is just nuts. So they're mating right now, and the females hold on to the sperm long enough and for whether spring comes early or late. That's your bat back for the day. So yeah. Yeah, bats are incredible. They're mammals. They're the only flying mammals, you know? And they pollinate. Bats, not the Connecticut species, but other species, are the only pollinator of the agave plant, which gives us tequila. So without the bats, that's what I'm saying.
Do they leave in the spring?
They do. They leave in the spring. It's not very practical for them to, you know, they sleep during the day. It's not very practical for them to sleep in the mine. It's kind of a hassle to get in and out. So they'd rather just do a tree or an attic or something. And it's cold right now, right? So in the summer, it does feel cold down there. It's 52 degrees, and they do like warm. Bat boxes are great. If you put those up at your house, it helps them. Gives them a nice space instead of your houses.
They eat mosquitoes.
They eat so many mosquitoes. Thousands of mosquitoes. So maybe that's why the prisoners were healthy too, right? Because there's bats.
Also, what they were saying is that because of that constant lower temperature, like if you ever notice you go to a doctor's office and the examining room is so cold. And I asked the doctor about it, and she said that it there's a certain level where the bacteria doesn't grow as much. And so down in the mines, there'd be certain types of bacteria that just wouldn't be growing there. So that helped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense. Heat is really bad and cold is really bad, right? So they were trying to do something good, believe it or not. The youngest was 14, couple 14-year-olds, all the way to, I mean, medium age was probably 20s, which is probably what it is today. Your young adult thing. The oldest was Prince Mortimer, and he was a previous slave who attempted to murder his master, and he lived to be 110 in prison. And they tried to let him go because he was more expensive to keep than not, and he returned once or twice because he didn't have anywhere to go. He didn't have any friends or family or anything, so he just kept coming back.
Do you have any stories about the Loyalists that were there?
The escape story is probably the best.
There were a ton of them.
Yeah, there were a ton of them. Not like the most, but there was a good number. I can talk about my history philosophies with it, but in terms of fun stories, I don't know if I have any other ones besides that. Do you have any?
Lists of the Loyalists?
Yeah,
Are they only Connecticut ones, or did they find them?
That's a good question. We have a really good prisoner list. It should be up on our website. And on there it would say traitor. Very rarely it wouldn't say loyalist. It would say Tory, traitor, attempt, enemy, aid, enemy. So you have to kind of read through the lines to see who are. And I would just have to look and see which ones were Connecticut. But it's fascinating. At a time when America, so this is my historical philosophy on it, at a time when America is fighting for their freedom, they're imprisoning people for their political ideology. So they weren't all prisoners of war. In fact, even those who were prisoners of war, they didn't want to be, so the patriots at the time didn't want to consider them prisoners of war because that means they could be traded back. It would mean that so this is how it goes. They didn't see them as prisoners of war because they didn't see them fighting for a proper enemy. They said, if you're in America, you are American. So why are we going to consider you British if you aren't? That kind of makes sense. So they would sometimes take them from their homes at a time when we're fighting for freedom. So it's just crazy. Who the government chooses to criminalize and why is really important to look at through our history. And I think Loyalists is a really good example of that. War on drugs, etc. Questions, thoughts? Is that where we're going to end this? Shoot. Oh, you're still recording.
What was the date that Terry asked you? Terry, what was the date you mentioned before?
That I mentioned?
That she has something going on?
Oh, yeah. So we do have a reenactment. Yeah, Saturday, September 21st, reenactment, 10 to 4:30, 5th Connecticut Regiment. They are awesome. They come, they just bring the site to life. So guards are there, prisoners are there. There will be an escape at 2 o'clock if you want to watch that, but no one knows it's happening. Cannon fire, musket fire. It's going to be awesome. Yep. Last event until Halloween. And reenactors will be there for Halloween too. So live, I'm tired. Yeah, live music, beer tasting, named after John Henson. Henson's 18-day red ale. There you go. And reenactors, and they will be taking a little bit of the darker side. So we have a lot of dark, fun stories that we don't talk about a lot, and they're going to be kind of depicting those.
And the pumpkins will be on the wall.
That's the goal. I know. Pumpkins are the best. I just called Meadowview and Browns today. So. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.